Good evening, blog viewers. Today we're going to continue looking at the virtue of self-creation through several short stories by Anton Chekhov. And I think on the blog we've looked at Chekhov's stories on short stories on several other occasions, and they are marvelous for the fact that in a very short time Chekhov is able to describe the various characters, set up a plot, and conclude the story while embedding many themes and very important morals within each of the stories. And I think the three Chekhov stories we're going to look at today, one is by the name of Champagne, the other is titled The Bet, and the last one is titled First Class Passenger. We will very quickly see that in these stories there is a lot going on of meaning within very short, very small short stories. And so, but again, talking about self-creation here, why someone would deliberately engage in such a project. Of course, it takes a lot of time to think through all these different virtues and values, and particularly the kind of self we want to become. Searching for one's own values is not an easy process if done maturely. To critically examine various alternatives, different alternatives to different forms of lives and different sorts of selves. It takes time. It takes sort of courage. It takes a lot of it takes a willingness to remain in doubt as to the different alternatives. Of course, just sort of choosing one, self and just running with it without thinking about it, just sort of choosing whatever feels right. That is not sort of the conscious self-creation that we've been discussing. And so the process takes time. The process takes a lot of courage. Takes a lot of maturity. It takes a willingness to remain in doubt as to what one will look like in 5, 10 years. And so when faced with all that, we could ask ourselves, why not remain content with living just a day-to-day existence, where we're not consciously creating a self, but we just happen to become the self that we become by virtue of the various different random, lucky, accidental things that sort of happen to us. How we feel on a certain day, the actions of other people, things that happen in our life. Those things naturally create a self, but they're subject to a lot of things that are outside of our control. And so in several of Chekhov's stories that we're going to look at today, I think we get some answers and some strong reasons for why we should engage in sort of a deliberate process of self-creation. And to do that, we have to first go through the stories in some detail. So I will go through them one by one. The first one, Champagne. It's the story is of a young guy. I think he's described in the narrative as somewhat young and handsome, and he works at a railroad station that is very desolate. There's nothing around for 15 miles or so. There's no human habitations of any sort, no bars, nothing. And this guy basically spends his day staring at pretty women that are passing by on the trains and drinking vodka to oblivion, as it says in the text. Chekhov writes about this guy: one would drink all one could of the loathsome vodka till one was stupefied and did not feel the passing of the long hours and days. So this sort of person, this character, is sort of occupies his time in sort of ways that are quite simple, drinking vodka and staring at girls. He's very affected by the seasons. In the summer, he becomes sort of affected with a sort of a lazy, melancholy feeling. In the winter, he feels oppressed like a heavy nightmare, Chekhov writes. He's fundamentally a creature that is bored. Chekhov writes of this character that he's affected by a sort of overpowering boredom, not the boredom of a minute or boredom of an hour, but the boredom that sort of envelops everything he does, sort of everything that he, sort of a day-to-day existence is suffocated by boredom. Now this guy, this character in Champagne, is married, but it's clear that while his wife is madly in love with him, he's not at all in love with her. He says, it's no good hiding it from my conscience. I don't love my wife. I married her when I was only a wretched boy. Now I am young and vigorous, and she has gone off and grown older and sillier, stuffed from her head to her heels with conventional ideas. What charm is there in her maudlin love, in her hollow chest, in her lusterless eyes? I put up with her, but I don't love her. And although his wife loves him very much, and suffers through his boredom, his cruelty, his ill humor, this character still cannot bring himself to love his wife. Again, says that he puts up with her, but he doesn't feel any charm in her, doesn't see any luster in her eyes, doesn't fundamentally love her. And so this character, we continue to read about. Chekhov tells us is unhappy with his life. He bemoans various things that go poorly for him. He's a complainer. Chekhov writes here that he quotes this character who's sort of daydreaming and saying, I've been ill, I've lost money, I get reprimanded by my superiors every day, and I go hungry, and a mad wolf has run into the station yard. What more is there? I have been insulted, humiliated. Now, as all of this is happening, Chekhov brings the story back to sort of a scene of action. There's a New Year's Eve celebration, and in this celebration, the wife of this character, her aunt shows up at the celebration, and I think this aunt is unhappy with her husband, and our character in Champagne immediately feels attracted to this aunt, his wife's aunt. He calls her he thinks of her as a new, young, beautiful creature who had a most subtle perfume about her, and that our visitor was a lady of easy virtue I could see from her smile, from her scent, from the peculiar way in which she glanced and made play with her eyelashes, from the tone in which she talked with my wife, a respectable woman. So, despite the fact that he's married and his wife loves him, and despite the fact that his own character has very many failings, this guy immediately, when the wife leaves the room, basically starts an affair with the aunt. And as we can expect, the story ends with Chekhov describing that there's been an affair, and then he writes, everything went head over heels to the devil. I remember a fearful, frantic whirlwind which sent me flying round like a feather. It lasted a long while and swept from the first face of the earth my wife and my aunt herself and my strength. From the little station in the steppe it has flung me, as you see, into this dark street. So this affair brings further misery to this man's life. Sort of a frantic, fearful whirlwind wraps him up in further misery, and the story ends as so. The next story that we're going to look at, The Bet, is a fascinating story. The story starts at a party in which there is a banker and a lawyer, and I think the banker is somewhat older than the lawyer. The lawyer is 25, and the various people at the party start talking about capital punishment, and whether capital punishment is immoral or not, or whether people should be put in prison for life. And the 25-year-old lawyer says life is fundamentally a good thing. He'd rather live than not live, and so he said, I'd much rather take life in prison rather than be killed. The lawyer says, I bet you wouldn't be willing to do that. I bet you wouldn't be willing to live in sort of a solitary confinement for 5 years. And if you do it, I'll give you $2 million if you do it. The lawyer says, fine, I'll do it, and I'll you know what? I'll even do it for 15 years. And so he takes the bet, and he's willing to confine himself in a small room for 15 years for the $2 million. In this time, he'll have no contact with humans. He can request any sort of food or wine or books he wants, but he can't interact with people, and he can't leave the room. After making the bet, the banker sort of momentarily regrets it. He says, what am I doing? You know, this is the greed of the lawyer at work, and this is my own sort of playful caprice that's sort of gone amok, gone to an extreme. I really shouldn't be doing this. But still, the banker, despite having that thought, he still goes forward with the bet. And so the 15-year confinement begins. The lawyer spends a lot of his time reading in this time. He reads a ton of philosophy. He reads the Bible. He reads Shakespeare, Byron. He studies various languages, history and chemistry. He spends time playing piano. Basically, sort of studies and pursues a sort of a life of the mind, as we've been talking about. And just as the 15 years is about to expire, the banker begins to regret the bet. He's lost a lot of money in the 15 years, so he's not as well off as he was before. He doesn't know if he can actually pay the $2 million without basically being bankrupted. And he goes to the room of the lawyer when the lawyer's sleeping to basically try to murder him. And he finds a note there that says that this is a day before the 15 years is up. And the lawyer has written a note basically saying that he's going to give up the money. He's not willing to do it. He's going to leave the room and therefore violate the bet just a few hours before it's over. And in that note, the lawyer, who's now almost 40, writes to the banker, "You have lost your reason and taken the wrong path. You have taken lies for truth and hideousness for beauty. I don't want to understand you. To prove to you in action how I despise all that you live by, I renounce the $2 million, of which I once dreamed as a paradise and which I now despise. To deprive myself of the right to the money, I shall go out from here 5 hours before the time fixed, and so break the compact." So the lawyer has now decided he's not going to take the money. He tells the banker critically here that you have taken lies for truth and hideousness for beauty. And he tells the banker that he's sort of taken the wrong path in life. And to do it, these aren't just words by the lawyer. He's willing to give up on the money that he would otherwise get, and so he's acting in a way that speaks to those values that he's now gained, affirms those values with a real action of real value that causes him to give up a substantial amount of money. So that is the bet. Then the third story that we're going to look at is it's called The First Class Passenger. And in this story is really about someone chasing fame. There's an engineer, an older engineer, I think in his 60s, that is in first class, and he's talking to a fellow passenger around the same age. And he basically bemoans the fact, this engineer, that he's been working all his life for fame and he's never got it. He's built 24 bridges in Russia. He's written several treatises. He's had various other accomplishments. And this guy is kind of sitting there in first class talking to another passenger, about how it is that one can become famous, despite the fact he's done all these things and hasn't become famous. And he starts saying, it's so hard to become famous. The only people, the newspapers pick some guy that's sort of a buffoon or some singer or some acrobat, make him famous for no reason, sort of bemoans the fact that celebrities are made in sort of a random way, not based on merit, individual merit. Writers, chemists, scholars of various sorts, he bemoans the fact they don't get famous. And unless any of those people do something stupid or immoral that would bring them into disrepute, then they, of course, would get famous. But otherwise, they wouldn't at all taste any fame. And this guy, despite the fact that he's built all these bridges, these 24 bridges, written various treatises, the only time he's ever been mentioned in the newspapers, funny enough, is when he has some affair with a singer. And this singer was famous, and so he sort of dovetailed on her fame and was written up a couple times in the papers. But very brief mentions, maybe a few words. And toward the end of his life, he says, "Oh, well, I've been living in a very small town. Maybe this problem is I need to move to a big city that values intellectual life." And he moves to St. Petersburg, wins some sort of prize there, some literary prize, first place, and still he doesn't get much notoriety. Even for that, the day after it's announced that he's won this prize for one of his essays, he goes and he goes to buy some newspapers, and he looks at the newspapers, and 3 or 4 of them don't even mention his name. One of them does, but does so only in a few words. This is some sort of brief mention in the tiniest print. And the story ends. This story ends with, again, this guy bemoaning that he's never become famous. Finally, the guy that's been listening to this guy go on and on for this long asks, "Well, have you heard of me? Do you know who I am?" And the guy says no. He gives his name, of course. And he says, "My name is Chekhov. Have you heard of me?" The guy says no. And then he says, "I too am a scholar. I've been a member of the academy, and I've been published, and I'm not famous either." So they both laugh, and the story ends with that. So what do these 3 stories have to tell us about self-creation and the importance of creating a self in sort of a more diligent fashion, a more thoughtful fashion, a more introspective fashion, a fashion that involves considering alternatives to your current lifestyle and commitments, and the value of those kind of commitments, the value of those alternative lifestyles, the goodness of those alternative lifestyles, the goodness of your own lifestyle, and sort of thinking forward a little bit about what you're actually pursuing, and how, if you were to achieve whatever you were to pursue, how good it would be. What do these stories have to tell us about that process of self-creation? And I think what all of the stories say in some form or another is that the failure to sort of systematically create and self-create yourself based on values that you've understood and values that you've sort of examined critically can cause various pretty nasty consequences. Going back to the first story, the Champagne, the guy in the station, he's got no commitment to his wife. He first of all marries her without even loving her. So he sort of just floats into that without thinking about it or examining what he's doing. He's got sort of an overpowering boredom with life. He sort of finds his only joy in drinking vodka and looking at women. He's very bitter about many different things going on around him. His mood is very variable. He's very much affected by the seasons that change, that come and go. And so, in general, he's living a day-to-day life that seems very unappealing, and he is unable to even control himself from an affair because, again, he doesn't have fundamental commitments to any values, to any sort of working through of the self he wants to become. When he's presented with a woman, an available opportunity in that woman, he jumps forward and pursues the affair immediately. So sort of reveals the lack of any sort of serious character there, a result of his lack of self-creation, I think. The lawyer, this going to the second story, the bet, the lawyer and the banker. It's interesting, the lawyer in the beginning, when he's younger, has not, takes the bet at a time when he's sort of greedy and obviously has not thought through a lot of different things. He's willing to give up, the best years of his life, his young years, and just sit in a room to get the $2 million. He's chasing money with the full knowledge that his liberty would be curtailed in the process. After 15 years or so, and he's 15 years into this process, he's obviously has self-created. He's read endlessly, he's wrote a lot, he's played the piano, he's had a lot of time to think, and at the end, of course, he gives up the money. He affirms himself by doing so, in fact, I think, and he is not willing to take that kind of money with that kind of bet, views it to be sort of tainted money. It's sort of hideous to accept it, doesn't want to do it, says, I won't take your money because I think you've taken hideousness for beauty, and I reject sort of this kind of bet. The banker, on the other hand, doesn't engage in any self-creation. He does the bet on a whim. He's willing to subject the lawyer to 15 years of confinement. And ultimately, when his fortunes turn, he's even willing to attempt to murder the lawyer. I think that's we don't really need to say much about the undesirability of that sort of life. Finally, in the first-class passenger story, we have the engineer spending his whole life chasing fame, whole life devoted to wanting to be written up in a newspaper, have some story, some newspaper somewhere in some town, some one page somewhere, and he devotes himself to that without considering what it is that would be so great about that, how that would actually impact him or make his life better or be good for him. There's no thought whatsoever given to that. He just spends his time, rather than thinking about that, he spends his time either chasing fame or bemoaning the fact that he hasn't become famous and bashing the newspapers for making someone or something else famous. And so ultimately he doesn't get the fame he's after. Even worse, I think, he becomes very cynical and jaded and very jaundiced about everyone and everything in society, and the celebrities in society, views himself as having much more merit than all of those people, and so on. So again, this kind of character does not self-create, and we can see that because of that, he spends his whole life being pushed toward things that in the end, if he had thought about it more, I think he would have probably realized the ferocity and the extent to which he was chasing whatever he was chasing was disproportionate to its goodness. And so I think these three stories all show in some form or another that, except for the lawyer, who at the end of the bet has self-created, and he sort of shines through as sort of a character that has figured out what's good and what's not, and can fundamentally decide that taking money as a result of that kind of bet would not be good for him. Except for that character, with all these characters, we see people that are sort of chasing things thoughtlessly. They're not willing to stand still for even a brief time to examine whatever it is that they're going for, and to create a self that slowly and gradually incorporates things that they've actually looked at and considered and blessed as good for them, and deemed good for certain reasons, and considered alternatives to those choices and those things they were pursuing, and determine how good those alternatives would be. And so these lives in the end have very little direction, have very little purpose, they have very little of a sort of a fundamental aim. Chekhov makes all of these characters appear in some large respect as very miserable creatures. by their own accounts. And it's hard to see any beauty in any of these lives. On the other hand, though, what makes it a little bit complicated, the analysis of these characters and the analysis of self-creation, is we don't get much of a sense of what alternative lives these characters could have pursued, especially with the character in Champagne. Of course, he lives in a very desolate town. There's no humans around. There's nothing there. And so that is a complication. If there's no alternatives, then maybe we can say, well, how is this person supposed to self-create anything if there's no there's no self to create, because there's no fundamental alternative available to create upon. And so, in that sense, we don't get a sense of that with that character, and we need to consider, were there options available to these various characters that were not pursued? These texts don't really give very easy answers as to these alternatives on these points, but we have to consider in our own lives, of course, most of us have many different alternatives, and so not sure how useful of an objection that would be there. Self-creation obviously has to arise from what is possible in our life. We can't create something that's not at all possible. So with these characters, we have to consider, was there a possibility there? And even if there wasn't a possibility for these characters, or if there's no immediate possibility for us of sort of self-creating in some form or another, then the question becomes, should we sort of step out of our present circumstances and actually create and will a self that's actually not sort of immediately available as an alternative? Should we sort of move somewhere? Should we go back to school? Should do something, make some fundamental change in our life, in the circumstances of our life, to be able to create the self that we want? And that would require, of course, more courage. And so even if these characters that we've looked at today may not have had alternatives that were available to them immediately, we could still say perhaps that they should have made an effort to find better alternatives and pursue them, even if that involved a change to their fundamental characters. And so I think we get, again, from Chekhov, some very strong characters here, some strong characterizations that pretty emphatically show the importance of self-creation, and a very deliberate self-creation, and also the pitfalls of just sort of living a life that ignores self-creation and basically is a result of whatever chance events happen to us. So with that, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.